welcome to AWay. Today we are launching AWay PSI seminars. These are regular seminars that we have almost every Wednesday. And today we are very excited to start this semester seminar series with a very interesting talk. And what happened yesterday in France was quite interesting and timely. As you know, President of France, François Macron, declared yesterday that April 24th is going to be the National Remembrance Day for the Armenian Genocide in France. Understandably, it raised questions and reactions, first of all from Turkey. And here we have today a very interesting occasion and to host James Robbins, who is an award-winning journalist, critic and columnist. He was raised in London, but now lives and works in Auckland, New Zealand, and contributes regularly to New Zealand newspapers and magazines. He's managing editor of the BigQ.org, which is part of the University of Auckland's project for public interest media, and is a producer and host of the weekly series The Great Crime, a podcast history of the Armenian Genocide. In August 2018, James spoke at the New Zealand Parliament alongside with Tanir Akçam, whom we hosted last June, AWay hosted. His forthcoming book is entitled We Dead Awaken, New Zealand, Australia and the Armenian Genocide. I got the email about James coming to Armenia, I guess it was in November or October, and I was quite excited about that news, and we decided to give this opportunity so that we can learn about New Zealand and Australian perspective on the Armenian Genocide, and to hear more about the unknown pages and unknown parts of this very interesting and still very, very relevant political problem. So with that, I'll give the floor to James, so please give me to welcome you.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, thank you very, very much for coming, and thank you to Varam for so generously inviting me to speak and for such a forthright introduction. It's really an exquisite pleasure for me to speak here at this university and in Armenia. This country and its history and its people have consumed my thoughts for the past 5 years or so since I started working on this topic. And it's a great relief to finally be in this place. Yesterday, I stood at the Armenian Genocide Memorial by the Eternal Flame, and it was incredibly moving for me that a place so elegant and so sincere exists as a testament to those victims of the Armenian Genocide. Is very powerful. What we're dealing with this afternoon, however, is the opposite of remembrance and the opposite of memory. The topic of my talk is lying side by side, the strange case of recognition and denial of the Armenian Genocide in New Zealand. And I mean lying in both senses of the term. In this story there is an intimacy and a closeness, but there is also untruth and lies and falsehood. I'm going to divide my remarks into two halves this afternoon. The first deals with the history, and the second deals with the consequences of that history. And I realise that for many of you will be unfamiliar with what New Zealand is, so it's probably best to start with the basics. New Zealand is an island nation, well, two islands really, off the coast of Australia, in the South Pacific, and its past is similar to that of other British colonies. The settlement of Europeans in the 19th century, leading to the oppression and dispossession of its indigenous people, and the creation of a reliable outpost of the British Empire. Now, it's been a pioneering nation in many ways. It was the first country in the world in which women fought for and won the right to vote. And it has always had a thriving parliament and a stable democratic system. And by 1907, it had gained dominion status, meaning it had gained some independence from Britain. It became part of the Commonwealth, no longer just another colony. And at the beginning of the First World War, its population was about 1.1 million people, so about half that of the Ottoman Armenian population. And when the First World War did come, the entire society mobilized. Around 10% of the total population would serve in the war. Young men rushed to enlist, and they believed that they would be shipped off to go and fight the Germans on the battlefields of Europe in defense of king and country and empire. But in order to reach Europe, those soldiers had to travel through Egypt. And it was while those soldiers were in Egypt, that the Allies began their campaign to breach the Dardanelles Straits and capture Istanbul. Now, by April of 1915, those soldiers had been organized under the same umbrella as Australian soldiers, and you had what was called Anzac, so the Australian New Zealand Army Corps. So whenever I say Anzac, it just means New Zealand and Australian soldiers. And it's here that we get to the very first connection between New Zealand and the Armenian Genocide at Çanakkale, what we, for some reason, call Gallipoli. And of course, the date of that invasion was April 25th, 1915. Those soldiers landed on the beach at the exact same moment that the spies and policemen of the Committee of Union and Progress were arresting the Armenian intelligentsia in Istanbul. This is the day that Krikoris Balakian called Red Sunday. Now, the fact that the Armenian elite of Istanbul were arrested at the exact same moment that the Allies were invading is not just an irony of history, it's not a coincidence. We know from the theory of cumulative radicalization that the Committee of Union and Progress, the perpetrators of the Armenian Genocide, felt threatened existentially at both ends of the empire by the Armenian resistance at Van earlier that month and by this Allied invasion. And it was this feeling of existential threat which led them to carry out such evil, of course. But here, for example, is the judgment of the historian Tana Akçam. Quote, "It appears to me no coincidence that the decision behind the Armenian Genocide was made during the fierce battles of the Gallipoli campaign, when the Ottoman Empire's very existence seemed to balance between life and death. The hopeless situation into which the Ottomans had fallen had produced a willingness to rely on extraordinary acts of cruelty." Now this, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, is the first of our historical connections, but by no means is it the last. Now I'm going to mention something that will be important later on. On that April morning, Red Sunday, the Ottoman commander defending the cliffs at Çanakkale was a man named Mustafa Kemal. Just bear that in mind. The Çanakkale campaign lasted for 8 months. 8 months of rather brutal fighting. And it was during that time that New Zealanders met Armenians for the very first time. There were Armenians that were sympathetic to the Allied cause, who served as translators and interpreters. There were also Armenians in the Ottoman army who had survived Enver's purges and who were captured by these Anzacs. In fact, New Zealand's official war correspondent at Çanakkale actually interviewed 2 of these Armenian soldiers who had been captured. And they had been in eastern Anatolia earlier in the war, and they had seen the earliest stages of the genocide. But more importantly than that, I'm taking a long time to open this. More importantly than that, New Zealanders and Australians were captured by the Ottomans, and they spent the next 3 years as prisoners of war. And they witnessed the Armenian Genocide for themselves. They saw the killing fields, they saw the deportations, they saw the concentration camps, they saw the horrible, ghostly aftermath. And they wrote about what they saw in their diaries while in captivity and after they returned home. Now, these are some of the men whose accounts have survived. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'll give you just 2 examples. There was Edward Apoteki Mosley. This is him in the top left here. Top left. There's Armenian homes smashed in, and corpses half covered with soil or flung down a hollow where the Turk had passed. At a brief stop on the march, Mosley noticed that all the houses were closed with shutters, and we learned that their Armenian tenants had been butchered. And further along, Mosley was confronted with the sight of a deportation march, guarded by soldiers travelling in the opposite direction. There was, quote, a great crowd of Armenian and Greek peasants, with old men and old grey-haired women, and children carrying small bundles, all herded together en route for somewhere. In this way, they are moved from place to place, their number dwindling. What the point of the deportations was. And it was the same with a man named Leslie Luscombe. This is him here. He was held for a time in a town called Eskişehir, one of the main routes of deportation for Armenians in the western provinces. And he saw, quote, on the opposite side of the platform, another train was standing. It was composed of a number of empty 2-tier steel sheep trucks. On the platform, a considerable number of Armenian women and children were huddled together. As our train pulled into the platform, Turkish soldiers armed with whips were driving the women and children into the sheep trucks. It was evidently intended to transport them to some distant concentration camp. Now, these are just 2 examples of dozens of other accounts. And even if these prisoners of war did not witness something directly, they heard about it through rumour and gossip and hearsay. If they didn't see, they knew. Now, New Zealand soldiers were not just witnesses to atrocity. In one case, one New Zealander gave his life defending Armenians and Assyrians fleeing annihilation. This here is France, and in 1918 he was part of a secret British mission sent to Baku to seize the oil fields after the collapse of the Russian Empire. But along the way to Baku, this small force heard about a crisis unfolding in the city of Urmia. Tens of thousands of Armenians from Van, those very same Armenians who had resisted in 1915, they had fled to Urmia. And now that same army was advancing on Urmia, killing any Christians that they came across. This Ottoman army, I should say. There was no chance that the city could be defended. So, a small detachment of about a dozen men volunteered to protect these survivors and refugees. And this included Captain Nicol and a few other New Zealanders and Australians and some Canadians as well. And on August the 6th, 1918, this tiny detachment of volunteers engaged in a firefight with Ottoman soldiers and Kurdish irregulars, and Robert Nicol was shot and killed. And he was killed defending more than 60,000 Armenians and Assyrians from extermination. Now, Captain Robert Nicol's sacrifice is one of the few examples that we have where an Allied soldier actively intervened in an attempt to stop the slaughter. To the Assyrian community in New Zealand, he is a hero, and there is a small memorial to his sacrifice at the military base where he trained. But for both New Zealanders and Armenians, I think, nobody knows who he is. And that, I think, should change. This footage, by the way, was shot by a Royal Army film unit. These are the refugees fleeing down to, or being escorted rather, to a place called Bakuba in Iraq, near Baghdad. Now, what about back home in New Zealand itself? What did ordinary people know about the genocide? Well, it turns out that they knew quite a lot. The genocide was covered extensively in the New Zealand press. Between January 1914 and December 1918, newspapers published more than 13,000 stories about Armenians. These range from sort of small reports to long feature articles to hundreds of editorials. I should know that there's 13,000, I've read all of them. And what's quite incredible about this press coverage is that it's very accurate. Aside from some stories that were sort of inflated or stories that blamed the Germans, the genocide was covered in incredible detail, right down to those important structural aspects that have only recently begun to be studied in depth. Things like forced religious conversion and the assimilation of Armenian women and children. It was all there. Now, the opinions of these newspapers showed a considerable understanding of the situation, and they were deeply sympathetic to the plight of Armenians. And as an example, I want to read you part of an editorial that was printed in the Evening Star newspaper in December of 1915. You can see the beginning of it on the far right there. The Star said the following, quote, "Over 500,000 people with feelings like our own have been butchered with inconceivable and unparalleled cruelties. Can our readers imagine what such a Holocaust means? Think for a moment of such an atrocity committed on the entire population of Dunedin, Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland. These are the main cities in New Zealand. It would drive us almost mad to contemplate it. And yet, while we are sleeping in our comfortable beds, enjoying the glories of spring and sitting in our picture theatres and crowding our race courses and places of amusement, these hellish doings have been happening to more than 500,000 men, women and children of passions like our own." So, if these debates or if these stories were being printed and these editorials were being written, what did the New Zealand government think about what was happening to the Armenians? Well, in short, the New Zealand government didn't actually have a particular policy towards the Ottoman Empire or towards the Armenians. It wasn't until after the Second World War that New Zealand actually had an independent foreign policy of its own. It was still governed by Britain. The decisions were still made in London. However, that did not stop the Prime Minister of the day, a conservative politician named William Massey, from using the destruction of Armenian life as a justification for New Zealand's prosecution of the war. In a public letter he wrote in 1916, Massey laid out his opinion on the war. What were we fighting for? Massey condemned the fearful war which Germany had forced upon the British Empire, which threatened not only national existence and the safety of the empire, but also the world's free democracies. I mean, we've heard this before, right? New Zealand was partaking in the war, Massey said, in the best interests of humanity. Massey then referred to the German crimes in Belgium and Poland and Serbia. And then he highlighted, quote, "The even greater enormity committed by Germany's ally in Armenia, where the Turks either massacred or drove to their death in the desert large numbers of Armenians, whose greatest crime was that they were a thrifty, industrious, law-abiding and Christian people. With a word, Germany could have stayed the hands of the Turks, but although presentations were made to her on the subject, she refused to raise her voice on behalf of the Armenians." Now, this statement is important. Expressed similar opinions, and there was even one New Zealand MP who actually saw the damage done by the genocide up close. In 1916, a MP, a Member of Parliament named Richard McCullen, went to Egypt on an official visit. And while he was in Egypt, McCullen toured a refugee camp at Port Said. And that camp housed 4,000 Armenians. And it was those 4,000 Armenians who were the remaining survivors of what we now know as the courageous resistance at Musa Dagh. Now, Richard McCullen was so moved by the plight of the Musa Dagh Armenians that when he returned home, he asked the New Zealand Minister of Defence in Parliament whether the New Zealand government would consider sending aid to them. It was, he said, a graceful and proper thing on the part of the New Zealand government to forward some contribution, no matter how small. Unfortunately, the government never did send any money. But that did not stop ordinary New Zealanders from doing so. During the war, ordinary people donated to the cause of Armenian relief. And by November of 1919, more than £2,500 had been donated to the Lord Mayor's Fund in London, equivalent to about 175,000 US dollars. Now, that may not sound like much, but consider that this was a country of 1.1 million people, and the economy had been essentially ruined by the war effort. Then again in 1920, there was a nationwide campaign on behalf of Save the Children, and that campaign put Armenian children at the forefront of their posters and their advertisements and their pamphlets. And by the end of the year, another 170,000 US dollars had been sent here, specifically here to Armenia, to feed the genocide survivors. But it wasn't until 1922 that New Zealand society was galvanized by a visit from a representative of Near East Relief, an American named Loyal Lincoln Wirt, and that's him in the bottom corner there. Now, throughout the winter of 1922, Wirt toured the country, speaking at town halls and churches. He showed a propaganda film called Alice in Hungerland, and he was greeted by mayors and members of parliament and religious leaders. And by the end of his tour, Wirt had succeeded in setting up a Near East Relief fundraising committee in every major city in New Zealand. And he did the same in Australia too. And when he left the country, Wirt said the following, quote, "My heart has been touched 100 times by the generous and sympathetic response which the people of New Zealand have made to my appeal for the saving of our Armenian brothers. Not long, I trust, shall it be, until an Australian mercy ship, accompanied by a New Zealand mercy ship, will sail by tragic Tunakale into the Dardanelles." Now that mercy ship never actually sailed from New Zealand. Again, it was Prime Minister William Massey who ruled it out. Massey, it seems, was willing to use the suffering of Armenians as a justification for prosecuting the war, but he was never prepared to actually do something to alleviate their suffering. But that did not stop the relief committees. They raised funds, they appealed to the public for any goods that they could spare. Old clothes, toys, flour, tinned milk, leather. And by early 1923, these committees had raised another 100,000 equivalent US dollars in cash and a full 20 tons of supplies. And that cargo was then shipped to Sydney, Australia, and this is it being loaded. This is Wirt here being blessed by the Archbishop of Sydney, I think. And then they were sent off. But where were they sent off to? Well, they ended up in a small town in Lebanon called Antilias. Some of you may have been to Antilias. You may know that it's the seat of the Armenian Catholic state of Cilicia. Well, where that cathedral stands today, on that very site, was an orphanage for Armenian children. And the name of that orphanage was the Australasian Orphanage, and it was run by two New Zealanders, a husband and wife team, John and Lydia Knudsen. And amazingly, it was actually John Knudsen who built the orphanage from the ground up with the help of the Armenian orphans themselves. And he and Lydia ran that institution for 5 years. And together they protected and fed and cared for several thousand children. Perhaps even more incredibly, the Australasian Orphanage was almost exclusively supplied and funded by the relief committees in New Zealand and Australia. There's a view of the orphanage. I should explain who these people are. This is the head of the Australian Near East Relief Committees, a man named James Cresswell. This is Lydia. This is a Near East Relief volunteer from Australia called Hilda King. This is John Knudsen, and again, Lydia and Hilda King. And it's amazing that these photographs survive, really. And the orphanage, I think, is an incredibly potent symbol for everything that I've just talked about. These deep and intimate connections between Armenians and a tiny nation at the bottom of the world. Now, if we were going to look at this evidence, these connections, critically, we could say that New Zealand's contribution was pretty small. more Russian, French, and British soldiers witnessed the genocide, Russians have a greater claim to being protectors and rescuers, liberators. And much more money was raised in the United States and Great Britain, as well as other places. And all of that would be true. But what came afterwards casts this story, this history, in a very different light indeed. The eyewitness accounts of Anzac prisoners of war were forgotten. The sacrifice of Robert Nichol disappeared into obscurity. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, the plight of Jews overcame the awareness of suffering and starving Armenians. Prime Minister William Massey died in office in 1925, and the memory of his recognition of the genocide died with him. And it's here we get to the second part of my presentation, because in order to understand why the Armenian genocide today is not just forgotten, but actively denied in New Zealand, we need to explore how it is that New Zealand and Australia came to form what I call a special relationship with the Republic of Turkey. Now, in both of these countries, New Zealand and Australia, every April the 25th, there is something called Anzac Day. Hopefully this should work. It's a public holiday. It's the most widely attended public ceremony in both countries. In New Zealand, it's the de facto day of nationalist celebration. And every year, since April the 25th, 1916, the same story is told. New Zealand was born on the cliffs of Cumulative. Because we fought under our own flag for the first time instead of under the British flag, we asserted our own independence. The fire of combat was the fire in which our sense of nationhood was formed. Now, I can't account for why this story is believed, because I think it's slightly ridiculous. Absurd, even. Nations can absolutely be born in war. Certainly the First Republic of Armenia would be one such example. But New Zealand was categorically not. Still, this story is told, and the story is repeated by government ministers and religious leaders and public intellectuals for over a century. And this is what a lot of New Zealanders believe. And over that century, Anzac Day began, how should I put it, eating other forms of commemoration. The soldiers who fought in France in the First World War are called Anzacs. The men and women who served in the Second World War are called Anzacs. Those who fought in Malaya and Korea and Vietnam and East Timor and Afghanistan and Iraq are all called Anzacs. This is a totalizing mythology. But for about 70 years, this mythology was individual. It was unique to New Zealand and to Australia. Neither of these countries shared their commemorations or celebrations with Turkey. Turkey, for obvious reasons, had their own forms of honouring their war dead, and they were entirely separate. In fact, New Zealand did not even have diplomatic relations with the Turkish Republic. According to one Ministry of Foreign Affairs document that I found, it describes the relationship between Turkey and New Zealand as, quote, generally insubstantial. And that is until the year 1984. 1984 is when everything changed. The Turkish, Australian and New Zealand government agreed to a deal, and the deal went something like this. The Turkish government would officially rename the beach where the Anzacs landed on April the 25th, 1915, from Aribonu, which is its old name, to Anzac Cove. And in exchange, in return, the Australian and New Zealand governments agreed to build monuments in their own capital cities, in Canberra and in Wellington. The process of building these monuments had two important consequences. The first was to begin creating this high-level diplomatic relationship, this special relationship. Within a few years, New Zealand and Turkey had cross-accredited ambassadors. They soon had embassies in each other's countries. They began to trade more heavily as well. And all of this because of the shared experience during the Cumulative campaign. In 1985, New Zealand began sending government ministers members of the military, members of parliament, and other dignitaries to the battlefields and graveyards of Çanakkale every April 25th. And this has continued on to the present day. The second consequence of that deal was that both New Zealand and Australia were introduced to Mustafa Kemal for the first time. And this is how the monument in Wellington turned out. And there you can see Mustafa Kemal right in the middle, looking every inch the tyrant that he was. New Zealanders began to be told the official Turkish nationalist version of who Kemal was, the defender of Çanakkale, the brave founder of the Republic, the heroic soldier, the father of a nation, all those sorts of things. And one of the ways that the New Zealand public was taught this version of Mustafa Kemal was through the inscription on this monument. And it says the following: "Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country, therefore rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us where they lie side by side in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well." That's attributed to Mustafa Kemal in 1934. Now these are lovely words, right? I mean, they sound merciful, they sound gracious, a testament to Kemal's generosity as a leader. And every Anzac Day they are read out by a Turkish official in New Zealand, a Turkish member of the embassy in New Zealand. And they are printed in newspapers, and millions of New Zealanders take them to heart. Except that Kemal never said those words. He never thought them, he never spoke them, he never wrote them down. In 1934 or at any other time. These words are fraudulent, they're false, they're lies. And what's more crucial, the line, "There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us where they lie side by side in this country of ours," that was invented purely from scratch in 1978 by an Australian veteran. But perhaps what is even more troubling than that is that we have tracked down who actually did, who we can attribute these words to. We have traced that quote to a man named Sugarkaya. Some of you may know that Sugarkaya was something of a right-hand man to Mustafa Kemal in the early Republican period. He was the interior minister and the foreign minister. But before that, during the Armenian Genocide, he was the head of what is called, in English, the Directorate for the Settlement of Tribes and Immigrants. In other words, the Ottoman agency that was directly in charge of organizing the deportations of Armenians. So, these words, repeated every single year, that are inscribed in monuments and in history books, that are taught to New Zealand children, the most sacred and admired words in the Anzac mythology, are the words of a mass murderer. Now, historians have known this for a few years now, but that didn't stop the Turkish government in 2017 from paying for a new monument to go in the National War Memorial Park in Wellington. And here it is. I suppose when you're so deep into the lie, it's best not to stop now. Now, I think it should come as no surprise that when you incorporate the fraudulent words of a dictator and a genocide denier, the man who prosecuted a near genocidal war against the First Republic of Armenia, when you give him a central place in your own national mythology, that the prospect of the New Zealand or Australian governments recognising the Armenian genocide is pretty small. In fact, it is precisely because of these reasons that the New Zealand government doesn't just choose to forget the Armenian genocide or ignore it. They choose to actively deny it. It is because of this special relationship built up with Turkey that the New Zealand government chooses to actively refute the established fact that more than 1 million Armenians were slaughtered at the hands of the very same political party that they built, or a man who belonged to the same political party that they built monuments to in our capital city. Now, I'm going to give you an example of this denial in action. In 2013, the New South Wales State Parliament in Australia passed a motion of recognition, and in response, the Turkish government had its usual tantrum, but they used this special relationship as a weapon of blackmail and extortion. This is what the Turkish foreign minister at the time said. Quote, "Although the solid friendly relations existing between the peoples of Turkey and Australia will not deteriorate because of this unilateral decision, its negative repercussions are nonetheless inevitable. Anyone who questioned the very special relations that exist between our peoples, who tried to damage the spirit of Çanakkale, will not have their place in the Çanakkale ceremonies where we commemorate together our sons lying side by side in our soil." In other words, because you acknowledge and recognize the Armenian genocide, we will exclude you, cut you off from visiting Turkey, from visiting Çanakkale, where your dead are buried, every April the 25th. If you recognize the genocide, we will directly interfere with your most sacred and important day of national celebration. Now, what's truly shocking, I think, about this threat is that it actually worked. The Australian government continues to deny the genocide. And in the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs briefing file, so the file that ministers and the Prime Minister look at whenever they're asked a question on this subject, this is dated to 2014, they directly reference this threat made by the Turkish Foreign Minister. "There will be no recognition because of our," quote, "strong interest in ensuring the centenary commemorations at Gallipoli go smoothly next year." And so, in 2015, and every year since, those commemorations went very smoothly indeed. Of course, it is not just the Armenian genocide that they're denying, or the similar destruction that was suffered by the Assyrian and Greek communities. They are actively denying their own history. Those Anzac soldiers who witnessed the killing, those soldiers who intervened to rescue survivors, the memory of Captain Robert Nichol, who gave his life to protect Armenians and Assyrians, and the words of a previous Prime Minister who acknowledged the killing, and those thousands of ordinary New Zealanders who gave from their own wallets and from their own hearts for the cause of Armenian relief. Acknowledgement and recognition, in other words, is acknowledgement and recognition of New Zealand's own past. Now, I'm probably trespassing on your ability to ask questions, so I'm going to end it there for the time being. You just want me here?
All right, thank you very much indeed, James. Those historians were more or less very much closer to this topic. Facts that you presented quite interesting. And but before we go to the Q&A part, when James reached out to me, he asked for this presentation to be reviewed. So he's also sent a paper to us, and I asked our colleagues from the Institute of Genocide Studies of Armenia to help us out. I contacted Director Dr. Mauritian, and he kindly forwarded the paper to Dr. Zoyan, who agreed to share some of her remarks and some of her comments about the paper, and she'll be speaking like 5 minutes, presenting some of her comments. And after that, James will take the floor just from there to answer some of those questions, and then we can open that discussion with Q&A session with the audience. So, please.
Thank you very much, James, for your presentation. Of course, it is not from the scientific point of view, so I'm not going to be judged from the scientific point now, because as we have agreed already, James is going to prepare an article on the topic he was just presented, and we are going to publish it in our journal. We have an English language journal on the Armenian Genocide studies, so at this case we will work on the scientific part of this article. This is, in my view, some sort of a political overview with some base that could become a good point for a scientific article. And this is much of a political topic, I guess, because as far as I understand, there is a lot of material from the archives and from the newspapers of New Zealand that proved the Armenian genocide, so we have no issue from here. I am just interested at this part whether the information that you have presented was presented to the New Zealand public or to the political people of New Zealand, and first, and then we can move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move this here. So, in August last year, when Tana Akcham came to New Zealand, he was presenting lectures on his latest book, which I hope all of you have read. He spoke, well, he was invited by a member of Parliament for the Green Party, which is now in government. It's the third largest party in the New Zealand Parliament. And the Green Party have declared themselves for recognition. The MP in question has said that they will press for a motion of recognition in the New Zealand Parliament. And alongside Tana Akcham, I argued for them to do this. However, I don't think this is likely, because it will go to the New Zealand Parliament and will therefore have to go to the government, and it will have to go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they will treasure the relationship with Turkey over any kind of sort of moral righteousness in recognising the Armenian genocide. But in terms of what I'm continuing to do, aside from the book which I've written and which remains yet to be published, but hopefully will be soon, I'm just going to continue lecturing, and I'm going to continue writing articles for magazines and newspapers, and push it into, and for academic avenues as well, and push it into those arenas, because they are the arenas in which you can actually make people's minds change. And I think probably for the most part New Zealanders are open and receptive to this subject. Every time that I tell somebody about what I work on, they go, "What's the Armenian genocide?" And then I explain it to them, and then I explain the New Zealand connections, and they say, "That's very interesting. I'd like to read more about that."
So we can state that the public in New Zealand, they are not aware of the Armenian genocide, so we cannot ask for recognition, and in this case the fact of recognition, it can be used only within the political discourse. Am I right?
No. I mean, some remarks that I prepared were that throughout what I was presenting, you'll notice that the government chose not to do something, but the New Zealand people did it anyway. If it was, raising money for the Armenian relief cause, if the Prime Minister didn't send money, New Zealanders just raised it themselves, and they sent it by themselves.
No, I mean,
but I know, but the one I'm getting to that. I think probably the same thing could happen again, that New Zealanders would be prepared to recognise and acknowledge and to understand and to comprehend, even if their government doesn't. Now, the question of recognition is an explicitly political question, but in terms of just knowledge and understanding and compassion and sympathy, as New Zealanders did 100 years ago, I think the more New Zealanders learn about this, that they can be compassionate in the same way, if that answers your question.
Yes, of course. So we need, first of all, to disseminate the information so the New Zealand public come to know what has happened and how they have contributed to the relief of Armenian people, and or how they witnessed to what has happened to the Armenians. Yes, and my second question connected with that, do we have an Armenian community in New Zealand? I know that we have in Australia, but we are very often blamed for not having an embassy in Australia, the same in New Zealand. If we change this policy, can it somehow affect the relations in this regard?
Possibly. I don't know. There is a very small Armenian community in New Zealand, and I've made some very, very close friends with them. They're very small though. There's more Assyrians in New Zealand than there are Armenians. An embassy probably might help that question along. I don't know. There was recently a Armenian National Committee set up in New Zealand, and they intend to lobby government and the parliament for recognition. And I think they're working on discussing things about Anzac as well. But yes.
Okay. My next question is connected with this Anzac myth that you were talking about. I would like you to dwell more about whether the Anzac myth is used by Turkey, or what do you think they have somehow contributed to the formation of this myth? Because it's really strange to understand how this myth can really affect the relations between Turkey and New Zealand and Australia as well.
Well, it's interesting that the really interesting thing about the building of this mythology, especially in the special relationship aspect of it, that it only dates from the 1980s. And you know, in Turkey, the foundational myth of the country was dated to the War of Independence, so it's to the 1920s. It's not to 1915. So in a way, creating this special relationship and sort of recoding this mythology is distinct from the traditional Turkish nationalist historiography. As for the mythology, though, I think the reason that it popped up to begin with, this idea that New Zealand was born on the cliffs of a country on the opposite side of the world, it came from probably a question of trauma, that so many men had gone and died and had come back wounded, of course, and they ended up defeated. The Allies lost that campaign. Turkey won, the Ottoman Empire won. And I think if we can salvage something, if we can rescue something from that experience, then we can, and we'll create that story for ourselves. I've forgotten what the point of your question was.
Okay, I mean, do you see any intervention by Turkey in maintaining or maybe forming this formation of this myth?
The building of the monument that I showed you, there's a monument in Australia as well, on Anzac Parade in Canberra, and it's quite similar. I don't have a picture on me, but they were both paid for by Turkey. And the one built in 2017, even after we knew where this fraudulent inscription came from Sugarkaya, it was bought and paid for by the New Zealand government, not by the Turkish government, excuse me. The New Zealand government received it as a gift. They didn't have to do anything with it. They didn't have to put it in front of their national war memorial, but they chose to. And the introduction of this quote that I discussed is very much an attempt to influence how New Zealanders and Australians see Mustafa Kemal especially.
Okay, because it's really very strange and also interesting to find out how this became part of your New Zealand's identity, because as much as I read during this past 2-3 years, it is very much stressed that this myth is part of New Zealand's identity,
Totally,
New Zealanders, and this is really very strange and also
it's deeply strange. When I was preparing my remarks for today, I was sort of reflecting on it, and I'm thinking, this is deeply unusual. No other country would think about their own history in this way, but New Zealanders and Australians do. I think I should say that today, or technically yesterday in New Zealand, was a day called Waitangi Day. And that was when there was a treaty signed between the British Crown and the Indigenous people of New Zealand. And I think that could be considered a foundational day in New Zealand, far more than Anzac Day could be. But of course it's mired by political fights and a rightful demand by the Indigenous people of New Zealand to have their grievances redressed. Yes.
Yes, I can understand that this is the first time that the troops, they appear under their flag, but they were fighting against their enemy, but on the other side they were saving the lives of millions of people, so this could be another good foundation for building an identity, why they have chosen the enemy part and why they have decided to go to deal with an enemy. That's really very interesting.
It is quite interesting, and it's something that I skipped over for reasons of time. But in the New Zealand newspapers, in the press, there was a debate going on about how should we view the enemy, how should we view the Ottomans. And because on the one hand you had this feeling that emerged from soldiers at the front in the trenches who thought of the common Ottoman soldier as a gentleman and a clean fighter. We called him Abdul as a friendly sort of patronym, and they had a sort of friendliness, I suppose, even in war. But the debate was about, well, do we take this view of the common Ottoman soldier, or do we take the view of the common Ottoman soldier participating in the Armenian Genocide? And there was one New Zealand newspaper who used the sort of metaphor of, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So the sort of monster and the gentleman, or the devil and the gentleman. And this debate was going on, and it was very complex, and it was full of ironies and contradictions. But over the years, it was condensed down, and those contradictions and ironies disappeared, and it became a matter of just regarding the common Ottoman soldier, or Turkish soldier as he was known, as a clean fighter and a gentleman, and he fought us well, therefore we should be friends with him now. And one other thing that I wanted to say is that I think this is a sort of, I don't like using this word, but problematic aspect of this mythology, is that this form of friendship between countries that were formerly at war is a good thing in its own way. I don't think we can look at many other instances in history where two nations were at war with another, and then 100 years later they have a very close relationship. There's not many examples of that. There probably should be more examples of that in the future. Russia, yes. Indeed, but it's, in one way it's a good thing, but in another way it's a deeply damaging thing because it enforces denial of the Armenian Genocide. It enforces this mythology.
Okay, I guess we are now ready. Thank you very much. I guess we are now ready to take some questions from the floor. You may want to lead the discussion, James. Just
sure, absolutely. You had your hand up.
So Rafi was first.
Hi. My apologies if I'm leading you on a tangent, but
no.
I just thought maybe if you could speak more of the foundation element of the Anzac myth, because last year was the 100th anniversary of the armistice, and my own great grandfather fought in the Canadian Army, and he fought in a battle called the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Although maybe unlike the Kiwis, we actually did win that one. But Vimy Ridge is known in Canada as the battle which formed Canada.
Okay.
And it's commemorated on April 9th every year. In fact, 2017 was a big anniversary. The Prime Minister was in France, and we made a big deal out of it. Now, of course, it's kind of overshadowed by the 1st of July, which is Canada Day, or previously Dominion Day. But nevertheless, I mean, you say that Australia and New Zealand are oddities for having this notion that their national identity was created on the shores of another foreign country, but we really have the same idea, and I think many others do. So what part of it is really a myth, is my question. I mean, the whole idea, at least the way Canadians understand Vimy Ridge, is that it was the first time that Canadian Army Corps functioned on its own, set its own objectives and met them. And that created the notion that Canada was separate from Britain at the time, and we were no longer simply colonials. And I kind of always assumed that was a similar feeling to what Australians and Kiwis would have.
Well, that's a very good question. You've captured the contradiction very well. How should I approach this? I raised the Waitangi Day just earlier. That's a signing of a document between the indigenous people of New Zealand and the British Crown. And it set up basically the basis for colonial rule. And then informed later significant parts of how the government today operates in New Zealand, it must operate on the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, this dates to the mid-1800s. I should know the date, but I don't. But that's a foundational moment in terms of the creation of a country, in terms of the reconciling of its indigenous people and its recent immigrants, shall we say. There is no, I don't think it, I don't call it an oddity. Like I understand that the Canadians have this idea about their nations being born in battle and all of these things. I call it ridiculous because I think it is. I think that your national identity is not bound up with your military, with your army. Your national identity is bound up with your history and your sense of identity, not with any kind of military. So what I'm doing in essence is critiquing this idea of where New Zealand and in some cases Australia came from. I'm trying to re-divert attention back towards the Treaty of Waitangi, which I don't have much more time to go into. But does that sort of answer your question a little bit?
Can't it be both? I mean, I take it Treaty of Waitangi is part of New Zealand identity.
Sure.
Perhaps not so much as Anzac Day.
Yeah.
But, well, I mean, close. I think they're both. I mean, you don't have to have one single thing. So there is a number of markers of New Zealand identity. Treaty of Waitangi, 1840 is one.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think Anzac Day, 1915 is another. I mean, I don't find it that strange. I mean, as Rafi says, this is a moment at which they were acting with some independence from the British Empire.
Yeah, if I may add to the comment, I think that for Dominions in particular, we have this issue where we cannot really pick an Independence Day because we don't have any. For the Americans, for example, when they celebrate Independence Day, they have a clear-cut date in which they separated from the British Empire, and they had the added benefit of militarily doing so. So you've got the whole nation being born in blood aspect to it, and a set date. And for us, it's when? Is it the Westminster Treaty? I mean, is it the British Nationality Act? For us, Canada Day, we call it originally Dominion Day, was a big issue because it was the first time that the governments of the separate colonies of British North America formed as a single government, as a single representative government.
Yeah.
But really, I mean, we only repatriated our constitution in 1982. So when was Canada born?
Let me take it from another perspective then. I would think that it would be a very strange sense of independent nationality or nationhood that was being asserted in the service of an imperial war. We forget that the entire invasion of the Dardanelles in order to capture Istanbul was on the behest of the Russian Empire. That was their prize, they had claimed it for themselves. It was at the pinnacle of the Battle of Sarikamish in January 1914-15 that the Russians cabled the British attaché. Well, he called them into his office, I think, and said, "We want compensation because we think that we've lost this battle against the Ottoman Empire." And immediately planning began for the invasion of the Dardanelles. So perhaps that would be another counter to your argument that there's no sense in which a nationhood can be asserted as part of a imperial campaign.
Okay, I mean, I don't want to open another discussion about whether or not World War I was an imperial endeavor.
It's an important question.
But one we should probably have there.
Probably.
I want to just get away from that sense. Even today, right now, there's a big Turkish population there. So leaving aside this immoral part of politics and immorality, I think they went through that and they recognized the genocide. Why don't you think that the other countries should just follow that steps of bringing some discussions and resolutions maybe in the governments to move towards the recognition, just taking in the base the example of Germany and some other countries, and not just the national pride thing and the celebration that your opinion.
Yes, well, we were actually discussing this yesterday.
Yeah.
That it seems that every time the Turkish government has a tantrum, and you can document them over the last, say, 20 years, the withdrawing of ambassadors, the closing of embassies, the threats about closing down American airfields in Turkey or missile bases or whatever it is, nothing actually really comes of it. It's bluster. It's a tantrum. I think tantrum is a good word for it. I think probably the same would be the case in Australia and New Zealand as well. For example, in the example that I raised in 2013, when the New South Wales State Parliament recognised in Australia, their dignitaries still went to Cumulative. They still went to the ceremonies. The threat did technically nothing. But the idea behind the threat is that it's supposed to scare them. It's supposed to put fear into a particular government. And in this case, it worked. And the briefing file that I referred to in the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it discusses this in some, I don't want to say detail, because much of it has been omitted because under questions of national security. But it does say, if we follow the example of the New South Wales State Parliament, if we follow the example of Germany, or France, or Sweden, or whatever, or however many American states have recognised, we fear that there will be repercussions. And that fear is enough. And that's precisely what Turkey's looking to do. So I think part of the argument, yes, could be, nothing will happen. Why don't you try and see and find out?
It's interesting that you said that the document, it was 2013, 2014, referred to not wanting to risk the 2015 event. And that was a very big thing in Australia and New Zealand. It was the centenary. It'd be interesting if they still would have the same view now that that has passed. They don't have to fear perhaps so much. I mean, so even if the view of the government was, okay, maybe this is just a false threat from Turkey, they didn't want to take the chance on not being allowed to come to Turkey in 2015 for the big centenary. Now, even if they might say to themselves, okay, maybe it's bluster from Turkey, maybe not, but now the stakes aren't so big, and so maybe they can take a chance on recognizing the genocide.
Let me give you an update. In August of last year, so basically at the same time same day that Tana Aktam and I were in Wellington, we were speaking to a journalist, and we did a small piece for television, and we got that journalist to ask the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, you maybe have seen her on the news at some point, we got this journalist to ask Jacinda Ardern, the Green Party are pressing for recognition, wouldn't you, as the leader of the government, like to do that as well? And Jacinda Ardern, and this is amazing for a politician to watch, really, she had somehow memorized, in about 3 hours that it took between us talking to the journalist and the journalist asking the question, had somehow memorized exactly what the briefing file says. We think, as New Zealand, that this matter is best left between Turkey and Armenia to work through. We think it's best left to the historians to work through, etc., etc. We've heard these excuses before. Now, it wasn't in the context of Anzac Day, that's true. But that part of the briefing file is permanent, so far as I know. That will always be there. And so if we raise this question again in April this year, which I hope to do, then I expect that the response will still be the same. And my response will be, well, nothing will happen.
Well, James, thank you for presentation, and I just want to say that I completely share the last part of your answer to the question of Rafi regarding the issue as how do I imagine New Zealand is at the end of the known world, and suddenly New Zealand soldiers participated in the world war, so world event, world scale event, and that is why that day is very important for them for creating some type of new national identity. So I suppose that the participation in the Gallipoli is important for New Zealanders from that point of view. Two questions. So what do you feel yourself that day? Do you feel yourself victims or winners or just I don't know what? And the second question, because I'm representative of the museum, I may suggest to organize a temporary exhibition of Armenian Genocide in the New Zealand or Australia. Thank you.
That's a wonderful idea. There's actually a chap named McCullen has an amazing collection of photos of the Australasian Orphanage, some of which we saw before, which I'm sure if you got in touch with him, he'd be happy to to lend you to the museum. Winners and losers. It's an interesting question. There is I included it in a draft of my remarks and I took it out, so I don't have it with me. But it's a newspaper editorial published on, I think, April the 24th, 1916, so the day before the very first Anzac Day. And it talks about, you know, the brave and heroic New Zealand soldiers who proved their worth on the battlefields of the world, and asserted a sense of nationhood and so on and so forth. And it's not changed. What was written in that editorial in 1916 is you could hear coming out of the mouth of a member of parliament or a prime minister in New Zealand every April 25th. It's exactly the same. So, as I said before, I think part of it is the shock, maybe, that you send your military to the other side, or part of your military to the other side of the world. They fight under their own flag for the first time, and so many of them die. And so many of them come back wounded and traumatized. That, in a way, you have to salvage something from that experience. You have to say, well, we didn't lose the battle. You know, we had a gracious retreat. You know, we didn't lose. We were victors because we won the sense of nationhood, I suppose. Yeah, does that answer your question somewhat?
Some sort of
we consider ourselves winners. Yeah, and that sense has been we say ourselves, New Zealanders. They consider themselves winners in a way. Yeah.
So as I will again cite Mr. Maruchan, he very often speak about the memory. So what part of Armenian genocide, how can it become part of New Zealand's memory? So we have a very long cut. We have this 1915 events when they speak and they somehow act. So we have a full blank pages of several years.
Yes.
So you have started now to speak about that. So I guess that they have to somehow get acquainted with this idea, maybe. So all this memory and their participation should be somehow revived again.
Yes.
So your public get acquainted to this again.
Yes.
Because they haven't heard about the Armenian genocide, and one day you and Taner Akçam, you are speaking about the Armenian genocide.
Well, yes, and it goes back to 2015. Obviously, both the centenary of Anzac Day and the centenary of the commemoration of the Armenian Genocide, and it was quite strange because that's the year that I first started publishing articles about these connections, and there were two other journalists in New Zealand, technically three other journalists in New Zealand who also published stuff at the same time. So something had happened, clearly. Something had happened in the sense of a political awareness, shall we say, of the Armenian Genocide, and a sort of public questioning of the Anzac mythology that led, not just me, but three other people to essentially write very, very similar things. And two of them are very good friends of mine now. So yeah, something happened in 2015. I don't know what it is, but it's very interesting. After a century of silence, and it suddenly comes back.
I have a small question. How
Sure.
Taner Akçam why he came to New Zealand to present his book? I mean, what's the importance of New Zealand for?
He was invited by the Australian ANC, and they decided to coincide Taner's tour with the creation of the New Zealand ANC, if that makes sense. Yeah. There was a question there.
Anyone who knows New Zealand knows that its identity was forged on a rugby field and not on a battlefield.
Yeah, thank you.
That's probably just some backstory. One question I have was in relation to if you look at recognition, it's a strategy, not an objective. So we try to work on recognition in other states with the objective of forcing Turkey or applying pressure on them so that they ultimately recognize the genocide and so forth. In your assessment of things, how close is recognition in New Zealand, and how much pressure do you think a country the size of New Zealand would actually apply pressure on Turkey to itself assess its own issue?
Divide that into two parts. How close is New Zealand? It's difficult to say. At some point this year, I believe the Green Party will put a motion before Parliament to recognise the Armenian Genocide. I think it will fail. I think it will fail. It'll be a noble failure, but it will fail all the same. And I think that will be precisely because too many parties will not want to upset this special relationship with Turkey. So a bit of education needs to go on with these members of Parliament to tell them, one, it's a way of, as you say, putting pressure on Turkey. And it's also a way of, and also nothing will happen, as I mentioned before. The second part of your question is, in essence, asking how much Turkey itself or the Turkish government cares about this special relationship. I don't think they care at all. I think it's useful propaganda for them. They can say, look at this alliance that we formed in our tradition of allying with Western nations. But, you know, if you recall back to when I quoted the Turkish Foreign Minister, Ahmet Davutoglu, at the time, when he essentially used the special relationship, and not just the special relationship, but the quote from Mustafa Kemal, this fraudulent quote, in his threat against the Australian government, or the New South Wales State Parliament anyway. So if they're willing to use those symbols as a weapon of extortion and blackmail, then I think they're willing to totally violate the entire special relationship in order to uphold their own mythology about the origins of their own country, if that makes sense.
Just on that also, how much has that actually morphed in recent times? Because we had a Prime Minister in Australia in the early 90s who actually made a statement that he would never go to Anzac Cove because it's a myth that's nonsensical, that he'd prefer to go to Kapuka. His name is Paul Keating. I wonder how much, and then since then there's been many conservative governments and so forth that have had a multiplying effect on this mythology in Australia. How much has that had an impact also in New Zealand? I can't imagine it being...
What do you mean by multiplying impact? What does that mean?
The mythology has just magnified. It
right.
Just much larger than it previously was.
Yes.
I don't think Australian identity was defined by Anzacs in 1915 at the time.
Sure.
It's a phenomenon that came in the 80s, started off in the 90s, and then just took off in the early 2000s. It's actually quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Until 1974, there were no relations with Turkey, and then because of economic hardship, Turks were allowed into Australia and so forth. It's a complex history. I'm sure the same applies in New Zealand. But
yeah.
I just want to know, this Anzac story in New Zealand, when did it actually start to take off? Because identity hasn't prehistorically been associated with the Anzac story.
A slight correction on your... Australia had embassies in Turkey since the 60s, since the 1960s at least.
No, immigration, sorry, my apologies.
Okay.
Immigration wasn't allowed to. So.
Because I know that it was slightly earlier than New Zealand. New Zealand is late 80s, early 90s. I'm going to divide that into two separate parts. Australia and New Zealand in their commemoration of Anzac Day, I think you'll find are quite a little bit distinct. Like Australia is a lot more militarized. There's a lot more heavy involvement of the Defence Ministry, or the Department of Defence I should say, and the Veterans Association, which is a very conservative organisation. And they will absolutely go after anybody who criticises this mythology. And it's very militarised, and it's a lot more serious, and it's got a lot more, it's more chauvinistic, I think we could say. In New Zealand, it's a little bit more gentle, it's a little bit softer, but it's still there, and it's still a mythology. Where did it come from? I think latently it was always there, since 1916. As I mentioned with that newspaper editorial published in 1916, the language hasn't changed much, and I don't think it's likely to change. Well, I mean, it has changed in the sense that it's incorporated Turkey into it, and has incorporated this valorized portrayal of Mustafa Kemal. So that's been the major thing that's changed about it, is that it's included Turkey into this special relationship, as I call it. And you know, I mentioned it during my remarks that you know, Anzac came to mean all of these different things. It wasn't just the First World War soldiers who served at Cumulative. It was soldiers who served in France in the Second World War, Malaya, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, etc. So it sort of consumed everything else, and including it consumed Armistice Day. You know, incredibly important in Britain, not so important here. We still have it. We still have commemorations for Armistice Day, but nowhere near as important. It's sort of been eaten up by this Anzac mythology. Does that get to the heart of your question?
I think he was asking, is it increasing? It does seem to be increasing every year.
Yeah.
More people.
I think in Australia it is, but I don't know. New Zealand, maybe not so much. It's a sort of stasis. I think it's sort of, you know, it went up in 2015 and then just sort of returned to normal again.
But are you sure that this is the basis for denial, or there may be some other causes, maybe political, economic, or something like that?
You know, trade with Turkey is not nearly high enough for it to be, you know, considered a threat, and that's what the briefing file says. It very explicitly says. But
the other countries, they are not also either explicitly state
yes.
that they don't accept the Armenian Genocide because we have very good trade relations with
No,
Turkey.
you're absolutely right, and this I'll end on this. The New Zealand and Australia deny for very distinct reasons than the United States or the United Kingdom do. The United States and the US and the UK deny because they have significant economic and military ties with Turkey. And whenever you know, a US state recognizes, Turkey says, all right, well, you're not allowed to fly missions to Iraq from our air bases. So, you know, they have a pretty good reason not to do that if they're so concerned about bombing Iraq. But, you know, so it's a very distinct reason in that sense. So it's not anything to do with trade or, you know, international diplomacy. It's very specifically about this special relationship and the shared experience at Cumulative.
Okay, so and one very quick question before we bring this event to an end. 4 years ago, the date was moved from April 25th to April 24th, just to deviate attention from the centennial of the Remembrance Day of Armenian Genocide. So I want to know, did it raise any questions, any discussions in New Zealand or Australia?
Not any conversation of any public significance. But I'll tell you what it did do. There was a journalist who asked a question of the New Zealand Foreign Minister in 2015. And it was explicitly about this, about Turkey bumping back a day their planned commemorations at Cumulative itself. And it was from that journalist's questions that we got the first ever, well, since William Massey in 1916, the first ever, in modern times, statement on the Armenian Genocide from a New Zealand official, which was, we considered these events to be between Armenia and Turkey to work through or whatever it was. So no public discussion, but it did get a statement. It made them think about their position for the first time, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I want to thank, first of all, Edita for coming and adding more points and some interesting insights about the discussion. And I want to thank James Robbins. It's not always that we have people coming from New Zealand. Please accept our certificate of appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very kind.
Yeah, so this is something to keep on your wall.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you,
very much.
everybody.